This was a protected space, but also an evil one. Standing in Andrew Nichols's room that night was like being in some kind of feverish nightmare, not only because of things I discovered there, but because of how I felt in that space. There was an overwhelming heaviness about the place, as if the entire room existed at the bottom of the ocean, and what I was feeling was the immense weight and force that thousands upon thousands of pounds of pressure would exert on this tiny, sheltered bubble of a world. It was not a healthy feeling. My head ached in a way I had not experienced since I got altitude sickness on a trip to Nepal when I was 20. My movements seemed slow, languid, and almost dreamlike, as if I was moving through water. Whilst I always tried to convince myself that I was a rational, hard-headed skeptic and that magic to me was just a topic of study, I had read many times what protection spells felt like when experienced by those affected. At first, I thought it was the room. Somehow Andrew had figured out a way to seal the place, making anyone who entered experience the dull throb and crippling weight that I was experiencing. I had read of many researchers who, upon entering the spaces set aside by magic workers in remote communities, felt a similar feeling until they were cleansed by the owner. Sometimes with a wash or rub of a boiled egg over the body that was then cracked and pitched into a bowl of water before being thrown away, sometimes with leaves of basil or mint bound in threes, but always before the cleanse, the heavy tug of a localized gravity pulling and clawing you down. Whatever the case, the idea that Andrew was responsible for the feeling ebbed away as I attempted to lift the book, the huge tome emblazoned with the legend, "This is the true magical grimoire of Thomas Blackwell, the Werewolf of Morton." I knew as soon as I attempted to touch the thing that this was the source of my discomfort. I speak not a word of lie when I say that even getting close to the thing was painful. My head throbbed with a pressure that felt as if someone were sitting inside my skull, just behind the nose, and pushing with both feet on either one of my eyeballs. Reaching for the thing felt like I was diving to retrieve something from the bottom of a swimming pool. A black brick, the way we used to for our lifesavers tests years ago, though the thought, articulated into words inside my thundering head, made no logical sense, it still somehow rang true. The book's former owner, the notorious Thomas Blackwell, had placed some kind of charm or protective incantation onto the book to dissuade others from reading it. The only way I can describe this type of repellent magic is to perhaps conjure for you the idea of radiation. A piece of lead that was highly radioactive might instantly reply to someone getting too close by the sheer force of the heat generated. If we think, for example, of remnants left over after the Chernobyl explosion, or the famed elephant foot pile of melted material that still exists there. However, if the material was radioactive to dangerous levels but not instantly lethal, then the effects would be similar to those I was feeling. They would encroach slowly, causing illness and deterioration of the cells. They would not prevent the individual from approaching the object initially, but they would dissuade them from doing so again, and would dissuade and prevent them from being in close proximity for any prolonged period. Still, despite the pain and discomfort, despite the waves of nausea that curdled up from my churning stomach, I knew that if I was to find Andrew, and more importantly, find and stop the thing he had unleashed, then I needed to see, read, and hopefully understand that book. I had of course heard of the volume before, though in all honesty I had considered it to be something of a myth. For years since Thomas Blackwell, the serial killer known as the Werewolf of Morton, had died, hundreds of misguided fans had descended on Morton looking to find some remnant of the dark magic he allegedly used, unlike the werewolves we tend to see on our TV and movie screens today, who are invariably victims, cursed to become beasts by the bite of that same creature. Thomas Blackwell was purported to have been a true chosen werewolf, a black magician who had used occult rites to purposely and deliberately transform himself into a monster. Of course, the authorities would claim that Blackwell was simply delusional, that whilst he believed himself to have transformed into a beast, he was little more than a crazed man who inflicted unimaginable savagery onto his victims. That, however, did not stop a cult following, inspired by internet memes and reams of sensationalist nonsense found on forums, from believing that Blackwell had somehow uncovered the secrets of physical transformation. Thomas Blackwell, these acolytes would argue, was a highly educated and dedicated scholar who was never prone to doing anything on a whim and without careful consideration. Numerous stories circulated about his other supposed feats of magical malice, all of which cemented for these fans the belief that not only was Blackwell a powerful magician, but that somewhere the records of his workings and operations probably still existed. Many times in the years since his death, Blackwell's house was broken into by teenagers and even researchers keen to uncover some kind of tangible evidence of his crimes and, more importantly, his methodology. This in turn led to whispers about a single book. One volume in which that wicked man had collected his knowledge and the details of his profane rites and activities. The whereabouts of this volume had been the subject of debate for many years, and up until the moment I actually laid eyes on it, I had believed it to be a myth. And yet there it was, sitting on my student's desk, and whilst I could of course have supposed the thing to be a forgery, perhaps a book compiled by a fan hoping to make some money by passing it off as authentic, I already knew that it wasn't. The evidence was right in front of me. How else could Andrew have made Gemma's jawbone implode? How else could he have had the success he had obviously had when he was, as his mother put it, making things? Creating it seemed life. One of those things, now lifeless, if indeed it had ever lived at all, was still on the desk beside that wretched book. The egg was slightly larger than a chicken egg from which a tiny and perfectly formed human arm hung limp. The clear success of Andrew's operations, coupled with the book's strange effect upon my own physicality, removed any doubt from my mind. This was the real thing. Having recoiled both from the book and the desk upon which the strange egg rested, I decided with an immense force of will that I needed to step forward, to take the book and perhaps the filthy specimen with me for further examination. As I moved forward, however, the sound of my step was accompanied by another smaller sound. I froze in place and listened. The sound, tiny, quick, and almost imperceptible, had come from the corner of the room. The sound, like someone thrumming their fingertips in a short, rapid burst on a wooden desktop, had been timed almost exactly to correspond with my own movements. Trying to use my own steps to hide the sound of its scurrying, I paused, then very slowly and deliberately took another step, allowing my foot to force from the floorboards below a long, high-pitched squeal like an animal in pain. Sure enough, as I moved, the sound came again, louder this time, closer. A sudden burst of rapid, percussive sounds. I stood, stock still, and surveyed the room. Perhaps it was the thing on the desk, the tiny, malformed human, dead inside its egg, that shaped my imaginings. But I think I can honestly say that I knew what I was looking for. I did not look around the room as a whole, over the bed or toward the wardrobe. I did not examine the chair with its piles of clothes clumsily strewn over the back. Instead, I looked to the floor, to the skirting boards and the dark corners close to the naked floorboards. That sound, the tinny little thrum like a cascade of blunt objects falling down the stairs, had brought to my mind a hideous possibility, that perhaps the thing on the desk was not the only one. Perhaps this grey-skinned failure, this crumpled carcass still inside its shell, had siblings. Certainly the sound, timed with deliberate, purposeful planning to coincide with my own far larger footsteps, could have been the sound of tiny, perfectly formed feet scurrying and pattering across the floor. I took another step and saw, a glimpse, a flicker, some suggestion of movement by the side of the bed and close to the window, another step and another quick-fire succession of steps. I turned slowly, trying as I did to survey the entire floor of the room. Was it simply the curtain flapping as it attempted to escape through the window? Had the edges of the fabric flicked in such a way that it created not only a sound, but the impression of movement, of a tiny shadow darting across the floor? My head was filled with images of goblins and elves, tiny pixie sprites with off-white skin, like minuscule mockeries of human form. Could there be such a thing in here with me now, watching? And if there was that thing alone? Suddenly an image presented itself, of Gulliver on his travels, of the newly minted giant lying on the ground whilst the Lilliputians swarmed and wriggled over and across him, What if, I thought, instead of simply pinning him down and conversing with him, the Lilliputians had regarded Gulliver as food? What if he had woken to hundreds of tiny humans biting and chewing at his skin, like a swarm of insects writhing and skittering over the flesh as they bit down and sucked? It would be like being covered in thousands of horseflies or leeches. Each of them was armed with a tiny mouth, a ring full of serrated teeth with which to puncture the skin. I pictured my own face, unable to move, as dozens of tiny figures, each only the size of my hand, latched onto the skin of the cheeks, the eyelids, the insides of the ear, and wriggled with slimy enthusiasm up the nostrils, devouring my lips even as I tried to scream. I searched the walls and the floors, looking in every corner for some tiny figure. I found nothing. I waited almost a full minute before turning again toward the book. Behind me, a burst of activity, a clatter of objects falling, a violent hiss, and a high-pitched screech, as if someone had stepped on a rodent or trod inadvertently onto the tail of a cat. A black cat perched on the window ledge as the curtain flapped angrily beside it. It was looking directly at me, and its jaws, dangling limp beneath, was a tiny man around the size of a Barbie doll and of similar proportions. For a second, I could not believe what I was seeing. Had the cat, enticed by the smell of the meat, come to claim the other dead creatures? It crouched, observing me as the thing in its jaws raised its tiny arms and clawed at the edges of the cat's mouth. Tiny fingers, thin as wires, pulled and gripped as the legs below furiously kicked. Part of me wanted to step in, to stop the cat from taking its prize, but as I watched, I saw the thing in its mouth begin to blister. I watched as its skin seemed almost to bubble and pop like melting cheese, as long, jet-black threads burst through the skin. Seeing this process was like watching a forest of thin black trees growing up from the soil, sped up 1,000 times. But of course, this blooming was not from trees. It was hair, fur. Below the panicked, frantic squeaking from the thing, I heard the low crack and clunk as bones, coated in muscle and meat, shifted and slid over one another. Before my eyes, the tiny humanoid was changing, morphing, its back legs still dangling pendulously below the clamp of the cat's jaws. I watched the limbs extend and lengthen out as the pelvis and hips rose and snapped back into a different, oddly angled position. The feet broadened as the toes fused together, and within moments the back end of the creature was an exact replica of the lower portions of the cat that was attacking it, all whilst the upper part remained a slithering abomination, halfway between a person and a worm. As the back legs swelled, ballooning in size to match or even exceed the size of the cat's own hindquarters, the tiny fingers plunged, searched and scrambled for the cat's eyes, trying to gouge and pull to break the head free, even as it transformed. I was transfixed by what I was seeing, stunned by the utter impossibility of this exchange. The cat was less concerned. With a single wrenching shake and one heavy bite, it skewered the thing's head with its canine teeth and crushed it. The struggling ceased, and the half-changed thing, with the upper body of a man and the lower limbs of a cat, fell silent and slack in its jaws. The cat regarded me for a moment, then leapt from the sill to the tree beside the house, still carrying the flapping meat of the thing it had killed in its jaws.